All right, we'll get started. Um, Good news about this talk is that it gets more useful as time goes on. So if you missed the very beginning, not a huge deal. This is Advanced Notation, a tactical approach to note taking. I am M-Nelly. I spent a good amount of time on help desk while I was there, built out internal documentation and self-service portals. Then I moved over to IT audit. I did SOC 2 and CSA CCM audits. So tons of writing there. Moved on to security consulting as
Matthew, are
a
you talking?
yes. Can anybody hear me? Okay. Okay. I'll assume that something's going on with Corey's setup. Um, Hopefully the recording comes out okay. But I'm gonna keep on trucking. If y'all can't hear me, let me know. Um, okay, so I did my stint as an IT auditor, did tons of writing, tons of documentation while I was there, moved over to security consulting as a penetration tester, and wrote a bunch of pen test reports. And now I'm doing security engineering things, and that's a lot of change management documentation. So I am fairly well versed in writing things down. Um, Hopefully, I can kind of share some of the lessons I've learned along the way in this talk. All right, scaffolding. I highly recommend anytime you sit in a talk or a lecture or a meeting, if there's an introduction slide that kind of goes over and gives you a high level overview of what is going to be discussed, go ahead and start trying to work out a template that will, give you a foundation for your notes in the very beginning. I'll talk more about that later, but I wanted to make sure that you guys have an opportunity, since this talk is sort of dense, to go ahead and get a template in. So in the speaker questions and in the chat for this channel, I've dropped a template that has all of this stuff already done. And then I've also dropped a zip file with the templates that I use day to day for the rest of my notes. So I'm going to start out, cover some questions that you should be asking about your note taking. I want you thinking about what your current habits are and then what you want your habits to be in the future as we kind of go through it. And then we're going to move on to the kind of the how of things, so techniques, tactics, procedures, and some of the things that I've picked up along the way over the past few years that have uh, made note taking for me not as intrusive and a lot more accessible than it was in the very beginning. All right, so questions that you should be asking. First one: when do I take notes? Uh, if you are anything like me, the thought of note taking always seemed appealing, but it wasn't necessarily something that came super easily. And it's not necessarily something that you can just do all the time, no matter where you are or what you've got going on. But the ultimate goal is to, obviously to write down all of the things that are important. So kind of start thinking about when you do take notes current day and kind of when you would like to be taking notes. I would highly recommend that all of the categories that are in this slide, you at least make some attempt to take notes. So while you're working, planning, training, or in meetings. Right. What do I write down? The easiest answer is nothing. Just completely forget about note taking. But obviously, that's not a very good solution. So then, the next most obvious thing is to write down everything. But that doesn't work either because you end up with time constraints and start tripping over yourself trying to interact in a meeting, but also keep track of everything that's going on. And am I writing down what I say? Can I type and speak at the same time? Maybe some of you can, but I can't. So the obvious solution to that is that you've got to write something down, but what is something? Um, I try to treat every bit of note taking I do as optional, and I try to give myself as few mandatory points as possible. the mandatory points that I have kind of landed on is things that I need to Google, things that I need to research. So if I need to Google it, it's maybe 10 minutes of work. If I need to research it, it's a couple of days, and then I write down all of my deliverables and every date that is given to me. If you get these four things in your notes and you send a follow up email after any meeting, especially one that's long or confusing, your coworkers will absolutely love you and you'll be fast tracking raises in no time. I promise. All right. Where do I take notes? This is a question that a lot of people who start taking the dive on note taking spend a ton of time on, and it's valuable. This is one of the most important questions. I will say that there is value in every single one of these categories. So, pen and paper, basic text processors, a uh, I'll say the worst knowledge management app that's ever been written, and then a series of good ones. The only caveats I'll give is that if you are in a face-to-face meeting, so you're in a conference room, you got a bunch of people that are potentially paying attention to you. You don't really want to be clacking around on the keyboard. It kind of nobody everybody knows you're probably taking notes, but nobody really knows that you're taking notes about the meeting. Versus if you had a pen and paper and you were writing notes, the people in the room tend to feel like you're much more engaged. From a social engineering perspective, that's where my brain goes, right? That I want to, in a situation where I'm in front of a bunch of people, I want to appease them as best I can. And pen and paper is a great way to show engagement within a meeting without risking looking dismissive or whatever if you have a laptop in front of you. Um, OneNote is not a great knowledge management app. It doesn't have a lot of the features that I need, and it doesn't have a lot of the features that you would need to follow the advice that I'll give later. However, it is going to be pretty consistently available, and it's fairly easy in most organizations to share your personal notes with your work account and then access your personal knowledge base if it's in OneNote, regardless of where you are, without having to worry about any kind of app locker policies or domain whitelists or anything like that. Um, the last bit is a dedicated knowledge management system like Obsidian, Notion, Evernote. I've tried almost all of them, and Obsidian has come out on top every single time. I'll get more into that later, but if you're evaluating a piece of software like that, I would start with Obsidian and rule it out as an option before you evaluate other options. All right, why do I take notes? I will admit that all of these things apply to me. On the surface, I take notes to keep myself organized and to remember things. I take notes so that I can share what I've learned with other people. But at the end of the day, I don't have all the answers for why I would take notes all of the time. It's not a question that you can answer in every scenario. And it's not a question that you can ever fully wrap your head around. Sometimes you're going to be writing things down and they're not going to be useful to you ever again. However, if you don't write anything down, there's no chance that that will be useful to you in the future anyway. So err on the side of caution and, write more things down than what you feel like you'll use. If that sounds familiar, there's probably a huge nerd somewhere in the crowd. All right. Uh, content portion, the your job is done. Now I get to explain some stuff. The how of taking notes. All right, techniques that I have discovered, developed, things that I like. Um, I really love shorthand. I really love Markdown, and tags, links, and content maps are an absolutely vital part of my workflow now. So, starting with shorthand, you're going to have to develop your own system. The key here is intuition. If it doesn't make sense to you, don't use it. And if it's not coming to you naturally, don't worry about it. This is going to start slow. You're going to start with mostly typing at your normal, verbose output, and then eventually you'll walk that back. Eventually you'll start shortening it. You'll naturally get faster. Things that were not necessarily intuitive in the beginning will just kind of naturally come out, and you'll develop your own system of shorthand, through muscle memory. But some things you might want to look out for is opportunities to remove filler words or do single character substitutions. You could replace words with symbols. Instead of trying to write down a ton of content in a lecture or a course or something like that, you can probably just point yourself, you can probably just list out a bunch of different things that you want to Google and get basically the same value out of your notes, if not more, at the end of it. You can shorten the names of things to initials or acronyms, or use informal acronyms. These are all uh, kind of surface level things. You can get much more complicated with it if you go googling for shorthand systems. You'll find tons of stuff that is way way beyond what my brain can comprehend in a single sitting. But the like I said before, the goal here is to develop this over time and to follow your intuition and do what feels right for you. Uh, I've found that the vast majority of the time in recent history, I've had plenty of time to do fully verbose notes, and I haven't really had to lean on the shorthand that I developed much at all. However, there have been a few situations, especially at conferences, where I really need to get a lot of information onto a page very quickly, and shorthand is the only way that I'm going to be able to keep up. All right. Part of your shorthand exploration, you need to develop a relationship with screenshots. I recommend taking screenshots of dashboards, graphs, figures, images, graphics, anything that is visual and doesn't necessarily translate to text. Just take a screenshot, and then you also want to be taking screenshots of any kind of proof of concept. So that really only applies if you're a penetration tester for the most part. But if you are in a position where someone's going to ask you to prove that something happened, absolutely take a screenshot in that scenario. Last thing is copy and paste. I try to avoid copying large bodies of text, and if I have to, I copy them into a separate note and then link them back into the one that I'm working on, just to keep everything nice and neat. I'll copy addresses and URLs so that I don't mess them up. Same thing with names. You should absolutely, regardless of the note taking software that you use, even if it's just Notepad, keep a folder with templates in it and copy and paste those templates um, into the notes that you're working on. If you look in the zip folder that I linked, you'll notice that my templates are super, super simple. There's not a lot there. That is intentional. If you overcomplicate your templates, it's only going to slow you down. And the focus here is not on adhering to, or not adhering to. The focus is not having something for every edge case or every note that you could possibly take. The focus is just having something to structure your thinking. Um, I think I covered everything. Copy and paste images is copying and pasting images is faster than taking screenshots. Just keep that in mind. All right, really bad Markdown tutorial. I can't teach you Markdown in 2 minutes, but I'm gonna try. Uh, when you're looking at a Markdown editor, most of the time, the vast majority of the syntax is going to be obfuscated from you, uh, or not obfuscated, abstracted from you. Um, but it's still fairly useful to know. And if you're taking notes in plain text, these can kind of help you translate later when you move from something like a basic text file to a more rich format, just to know kind of what the expected output should look like. This is basically all the markdown that I remember. Uh, Everything else, there's tons of other options, but everything else is pretty optional. The only other things that I would recommend you take a look at would be links. And these change slightly depending on the markdown syntax variant that you're using. GitHub does it differently than Obsidian, and Obsidian does it differently from every other markdown editor that's out there, but they're all relatively similar. Um, Again, you don't necessarily have to remember this syntax because you'll have key bindings or macros or something that will allow you to, inject these without having to worry about remembering the syntax. But if you're going to be taking notes in plain text, it's probably a good idea to commit some of your brain to learning at least just these few things within the Markdown language. Right. Links and tags. If you have a note taking solution that allows you to link notes together, I highly recommend it. Even better if you have a note taking software that will visualize those links. But at the end of the day, you want to be linking notes that you wish existed so that when you go back and reread your notes, you can identify things that are missing but shouldn't be. You want to link existing notes so that you kind of have that concept mapping going on. You're tying ideas together. You'll want to link any sort of reference material that you used while you were writing those notes so that you can go back and correct things that maybe you recorded incorrectly, or you can uh, reference the source material that probably has more than what you actually wrote down. Um, and then whenever you go to create tags, you'll find yourself in option paralysis very quickly. I would recommend creating tags that are either concepts that are too big for notes, so things like security or networking or development, or tag subtopics that might span notes. So things like version control or access control, uh, that you're not necessarily going to write a note that just covers that one thing, but you are probably going to stumble across various forms of that thing in other notes. Right, maps. When you have enough notes and you have enough links and you have enough things going all over the place, you're going to want to start backing that up and mapping out some of the content within your repository, even if that's just a list of your daily journal entries. For example, if you have I would say if you have more than 20 notes, you should be looking to create some kind of interactive map of the content that is within your notes repository. Um, those will come in various formats. The ones that I like are uh, just link lists. You can sort them by subject. You can add headers in that so that you can fold them and organize that way. You can do a narrative overview of a subject that has links to the smaller pieces that you've taken notes on throughout it. That's a really good way to discover content that you wish existed but doesn't. You can link you can create a note that is a link with supporting material below it. So you have this sort of like parent child relationship, but there are several child documents, or that there are several child documents that aren't necessarily uh, 100% related, but they support the original link. You can also do checklists. I absolutely love doing linked checklists for all of the processes that I follow. Uh, Not only because it prevents me from missing things, but if I forget how to do something, instead of having to go and find that thing, I'm already working through that checklist as I go through the process, and now I can go wiki style and reference that material, semi directly within that checklist. And then parent child documents, I've already kind of covered that, but a good example of a parent child document would be a parent document of SSH and a child document of SCP. Um, you're not really going to have one without the other, or not really going to be using SCP without a solid understanding of SSH. But you might want to split those out because the functionality of the two is fairly different. Um, okay, we're going to move on to note taking tactics. These are kind of qualities that your note taking should have. If you are opportunistic and fluid and efficient with your note taking, this kind of builds an intermediary framework between the actual techniques of like how I'm taking notes and bridges that into the procedures of organizing and expanding and getting your notes fully fleshed out. So opportunistic note taking. I'm gonna go back to what I was saying in the beginning. If you scaffold your notes during the introduction of whatever content you're consuming, you're doing yourself a favor. It's most of the time lectures, meetings, talks like this one, they template themselves. You just kind of have to be paying attention to it and quick enough in the beginning to catch all of it so that you have a solid template to work from. You can also use breaks in the talk to backfill detail. So in a bit, I'm going to break for QA, and we're probably going to have some awkward silence in there that you could be using to backfill details that you potentially missed earlier. Still rattling around in your head, but not necessarily on the page. And then use the conclusion in Q&A to fill in gaps. So as you're going through content, instead of thinking to yourself, "Oh, I missed that. I really wish that I had paid more attention or hadn't been writing this other thing and caught what they said." Write down that you missed something in line in the time that that you missed it, so that hopefully using context you can guide the speaker back during Q&A to the section that you missed and fill in that gap. Fluid note taking is all about keyboard shortcuts and keeping your notes close by. Most of you already probably use some variant of all of these tricks uh, just to get your job done. There's probably 100 more. These change based on operating system. This slide was never going to be perfect, but I think you all get the idea that if you keep your notes an alt tab away or a screen away, you're going to be much more inclined to just throw things in your notes really quickly than you would be if it was buried somewhere, if the app wasn't even open. efficient efficient note taking. There's tons of different things that you can do for efficiency, but I think the three that have really sped up my note taking is the ability to organize on the fly by adding headers every time a topic changes. In the case of this talk, it would be every time a slide changes. I also prefix with categories, so I don't necessarily do key topic finding and date. Well, I do date, but at the beginning of each line, whenever I've committed to writing something, I will add in a single character prefix that kind of gives me an idea of what the content of that line is going to be. So if it's a date, put a capital D, and then I'll put the actual date or something indicating the date after that. If it's a point that the speaker made that I want to reference later, it's capital P, and then whatever the point was. If it is something that I want to research, it's capital R. If it's something I need to Google, it's capital G. I keep that system going, and I've got a few more than that I do, depending on where and when I'm taking notes. But for the most part, I try to keep it super simple and intuitive. And obviously, there's a lot of different words that could start with any of those letters, but I kind of know it. I kind of know how my brain works, and I can usually reasonably figure out what I'm trying to get at just from the prefixes. Tags are great for organizing. Yeah, like I said before, you're gonna have this option paralysis of what are good tags, what are bad tags. You're gonna feel like your good tags are bad and your bad tags are good, and you're gonna switch them around and change your mind a bunch of different times. If it's something that you don't end up liking, don't use them. Personally, I don't really use them, but they are a tool that you can use that's fairly powerful if your brain works in a way that aligns with that. The next big thing for efficiency is shorthand. The more common things you can get super compressed, the better. The more you can have kind of built up in your muscle memory to shorten things, the better off you're going to be. Like I said before, don't worry too much about it. Keep it intuitive. Keep it slow, steady progress. Let it snowball on its own. but be thinking about ways that you could increase the efficiency by shortening the amount of text that you're putting into your notes. And then the last thing is to start from simple templates. If your templates are super complex, you're going to end up in a position where you've got way too much predefined nonsense to sort out, and not a lot of content that fits in any of the categories that you've created. So if you look at my templates, I typically go with a uh, an introduction, sort of things that I was given at the very beginning, and then a major section for my notes, and then I might conclude after, or I might include additional supporting information after. But for the most part, I'm starting with just a simple three heading template. Maybe sometimes I'm starting with a two heading template, but I try to keep it as quiet as I can. All right, procedures. We're gonna talk about node expansion, templating, and then wrap up with Zettelkasten, which is relatively new to me, but I think I've got a pretty good handle on it. Okay, shorthand expansion. Great options are predefined find and replace queries. If you're comfortable with regular expressions, this would be a great use case for them. If you're a Vim junkie, you're gonna have a field day with this one. If not, good luck. I don't know what to tell you, but I'm sure with whatever software you can reasonably figure out find and replace statements that work, even if you have to copy and paste them in. Uh, I recommend looking at variable substitution and then trying to do things like shortening to acronyms and then expanding later, so just so that it looks better. And shorthand expansion is only really important if you're going to be delivering your notes elsewhere. If you're not planning on doing that, I wouldn't worry about this too much, um, except for to explain and research anything that you have said that you're going to Google or research. That is massively important for when you're taking notes, because if you're not going back and learning the things that you said you wanted to learn, something is getting missed, right? And then, of course, anything that when you go back and reread and rewrite your notes, you're going to want to link all of the reference material that you used, just so that you have that completeness of, I know what I learned and where I learned it. Uh, can't do a talk these days without talking about AI. Uh, Large language models are great at crafting regular expressions and generating templates. You'll almost always have to rewrite everything they say in a more concise way. The last thing you want to do if you're using an LLM for note taking is to take a bunch of notes on a bunch of proprietary stuff, copy and paste it in, and completely forget about any of the company secrets that may or may not have been chilling out in that body of text. Um, it doesn't get much simpler than that. On the templating front, I would recommend scaffolding your top 5 documents at most. I would try to keep templates down to 3 or 4, and then maybe create a separate folder that's auxiliary templates or backup templates just for those edge cases. But you should be looking at your templates folder and be able to very, very quickly identify exactly what template you want to use and get it into the note that you're working on very quickly. You can also template common verbiage. That's a great use case for that. Alternate folder is canned responses and other things that you find yourself saying all the time. You can also template out metadata. If you look at the templates that I included, there's a TP file, whatever thing at the beginning. That's where I'm injecting my metadata template using the templater plugin in Obsidian. Um, I can show you guys what that looks like later, but basically it's just author, date, location, a comments field, and then a description. And all of those things with the data view plugin in Obsidian are queryable, so I can list them out in a table if I want to. And the last thing is that if you are cooperating with anybody on your notes, you might want to take some time and write out a short formatting guide. I think Adobe for their internal documentation has one that's massive, but it's is really good. It's really comprehensive. But for most use cases, I wouldn't recommend going that crazy. But if you are finding yourself sharing notes back and forth between yourself and coworkers or friends, it might be a good idea to invest some time in coming up with some standard formatting best practices that will keep you all on the same page, or at least inform the process of creating notes enough that you can kind of drop each other's notes into your personal knowledge base, and it doesn't necessarily feel out of place. So you guys have the latest templates that I have, but I wanted to kind of go through roughly equivalent templates to kind of show you what the thought process is whenever I'm creating templates. So this is the one that I use as my primary, as my research template. I have to dos at the top. Anything that I think of that I want to document later, I need to go back and follow up on, I'll drop it in there and slowly over time knock it out. Immediately after that, I include my reference materials because those, when I'm doing research, I'm almost always starting the next day of research by opening up one or more of those links. And then below that, I've got all of the notes that I'm taking on that subject. I'm not trying to break it out into subheadings yet. I'm not trying to overcomplicate the process. I'm not going to include a conclusion at this stage. There's several things that you could do that I just wouldn't generally recommend because it will kind of slow down the process. You really want to make this as stream of consciousness as possible while giving yourself guardrails so that you don't completely fly off the handle. Next example would be project notes. I would include references at the top because I'm going to do research on whatever it is that whatever it is my project is. I'm going to do research ahead of time. I'm going to drop a bunch of links in there, and then I'm going to start trying to configure things. I'm going to screw things up. At the bottom, I'm going to have to do a bunch of troubleshooting, document that process, and then I'm going to change the configuration in the middle so that it works. Hopefully, the next time I go to do it. But even if it doesn't, I have all of the things that I did to try to troubleshoot still in that document. Last template that I want to show is pen test notes. I have moved away from using this template in favor of documenting within the report template, but there's still some value here if you're not professionally producing these reports. I would typically I would keep my scope up top. I'd write a narrative that was everything I did and when I did it, screenshots of proof and whatever else, with all the links of websites that I tested and host names and whatever else. And then at the bottom, I would go for a short list of findings that I wanted to include in the report. I wouldn't write all of them out with CVSS scores and remediation recommendations and all of that type of thing that would actually make it into the final report. I would just list out what the findings were so that I could go do research and write all that out later. Okay, formatting best practices. I wasn't gonna include this originally, but I think it's important. I This is what my notes looked like whenever I copied them from another note-taking app. I don't remember which one it was, but I was copying into Obsidian during the migration process, and it included all these extra line breaks. And I realized that while I'd kind of moved away from writing notes like that in more recent history, I am definitely guilty of every separate thought that I had, enter twice, typing. And what that does for a reader is it really disorients them because you can't really distinguish where the ideas stop and where the next heading starts, even if you have the extra formatting things of like the headings are colored or uh, they're different sizes or anything like that, or they're bold. It's still confusing to the eye when you have all of that white space in there. We're used to reading paragraphs, and this is not in a paragraph format. So I went through and adjusted all of the formatting. Ended up with something that looked like this. Yeah, your screen gets brighter because there's more white text on the screen. But hopefully you can see that, if I added another heading after this and it would say like host related indicators of compromise, and there was a line break in between, that would give you a very clear line on the page for your eyes to go, okay, this is a block of information that all correlates, and then the next one starts after the next line break. Uh, you do what you want to do with your notes. Nobody's going to police you. But if I were you, I would recommend trying to keep things in tighter blocks of text rather than spreading things out super far with a ton of unnecessary line breaks. Okay, Zettelkasten. This is this is the one slide that makes me nervous on in this slide deck. Um, I have taken on since the beginning of this month. So with the new year, I decided to archive my old knowledge base and kind of start over. And when I started over, I started with investigating the Zettelkasten methodology. What I've come up with based on my research is a system where I'm taking all of my notes in my daily journal, a daily note, not necessarily a journal, but I'm taking all of my notes in a new note daily. Everything is there, even across subject changes. I'm then linking those daily notes as I'm learning new things into notes that I wish existed. Once I have a few links into a note that doesn't exist, I'll then go create that note and start moving the various pieces from my daily notes into this research note. Those become sort of permanent, those research notes become sort of permanent fixtures within the knowledge base. And eventually, once I have enough of those, I'll start having to create reference notes, which are maps of content that will basically give me a bunch of smaller uh, table of contents style notes to pull from, kind of focus in on a specific subject that contains a bunch of these different research notes. The cool thing about Obsidian is that within the graph view, you can see all of the links between notes. And the more links you add to a note, the bigger that node in the graph view gets. And the more gravity that note has to it. So it'll actually start to pull in other notes around it. And it'll show you, especially if the note doesn't exist, it will show you content that potentially content that should exist that doesn't yet. So you can kind of use these links and use this concept of gravity to kind of identify where you should be going. I have found already that new ideas, just from looking at the graph view and looking at where the different links are, new ideas are emerging from the links. And that is exactly why I set out on this journey. It's exactly what I wanted. I wanted to see through my normal note taking where new knowledge would emerge from concepts that I was already familiar with. I can't think of a great example. I had an example earlier, but I can't remember what it was, um, of a note that did not exist that definitely should have, that I discovered through this methodology. You'll just have to take my word on it that it works. Uh, yeah. Okay. I'm gonna take a break for Q&A. We're approaching like 40 minutes, so I'm going to do Q&A until roughly 7:30, or I run out of questions, and then just to show you kind of what's coming up, I'm gonna go through an example meeting that is absolutely terrible, and then we're gonna go through the shorthand that I use, a couple examples of the shorthand that I use, and example expansions. I'll kind of explain uh, how I handle that side of things. But if anybody has any questions, drop them in the DC 615 speaker questions, or ping me in another chat. or I guess this channel's chat works as well. There's a few different ways that you can handle it. The way that I handled it was to add I moved it into an archive folder and then added that to my um, excluded folders in my settings. You can also just use that same vault and then create a new vault, move over the pieces that you want between them. There's not I don't know. There's not a great way to. There's not a predefined way to do it. I guess is what I'm trying to get at. Oh, the question was, how did I archive my vault? Was there a method in Obsidian to do that, or was it just kind of something that I did uh, with a different method? Have you run into an issue where someone needs to read your notes but has never used Obsidian? I run into this frequently and don't have a great way of sharing notes with those who aren't in the Obsidian cult. Yeah, I run into it all the time. People who don't mark down trying to mark down for the first time. It's great. I actually did a workshop with my two coworkers that I work with directly all the time. I did a workshop where I set them up with Obsidian vaults and got them acclimated in the environment. And within a week, they were coming back to me going, "Hey, this is really great, and we really want to use this everywhere. Can we do shared folders and kind of co-work and do this, all this kind of thing?" And so we set that up too, and now it's functioning really well. But typically speaking, if I have to deliver my notes to another audience, I'll go back to either the default theme, the default light theme, or another really like toned down theme in Obsidian and export it to a PDF and share it that way. It's not the best solution. It's not the most. It's not what I would prefer, but it's good enough. You can also look at GitHub. Uh, there's going to be some syntax issues between GitHub Markdown and Obsidian Markdown, but it works okay. So if you go and upload all of your notes to GitHub and share that repository with somebody, they don't necessarily have to be well versed in Obsidian to navigate that, and it'll all render for them. Uh, I mean, I guess that depends on that depends on them being familiar with GitHub, but there is a way, right? Where there's a will, there's a way. All right, built-in sync service or cloud sync. Um, when I first started out, all of my notes were on a flash drive and backed up to another server manually. And then I switched over to GitHub and used GitHub for a long time. Built out scripts that I could add into my uh, built out scripts that I could add into cron jobs, and it would automatically sync and every 5 minutes, and that worked okay. Between device syncing and mobile was kind of a pain when I was doing that, and so I moved over to using iCloud. If you have Apple devices, that works pretty well out of the box for free. Um, that was great until I stopped using all Apple devices, and so then I moved back over to I'm going to use GitHub full time, and now I just buy the sync service. I don't regret it at all. The I've heard great things about a lot of different solutions, and I've tried a lot of different solutions. Never tried sync thing. Someone else might be able to speak to that one. It kind of seems like the next best thing other than paying for sync yourself. Um, but anything works. At the end of the day, you just have to build a workflow around whatever it is that works and decide how much time you want to spend or how much money you want to spend on syncing yourself or through Obsidian's services. I'm hearing Discord notifications, but I don't see any other questions. Yeah, it will. It'll the link will be dim, and then when you click on it, will create a blank note. You can also enable in your settings in the core plugins the backlinks plugin, and it'll actually show at the bottom of the note any linked mentions to the note that you're in, and it'll also show unlinked mentions. So instances where the title of your note shows up in your vault that aren't linked yet. And then in graph view, it's kind of the same way. It'll show a node with the links to it, but it'll be gray instead of whatever color the default is, and then you can add in groups to add colors based on vault location or title or tags or whatever you wanna do. Change channel permissions to allow everyone to speak. Oh, okay, yeah. So you guys can yell at me now. All right, I think I'm gonna move on to the examples, try to get through those pretty quick, and wrap this thing up, and then we'll go back to kind of like a discussion kind of thing. So it looks like most of the initial wave of questions are uh, at least somewhat answered. Okay, so example meeting. This is an enterprise software deployment. This is going to be painful and it's going to be corporate cringe. You guys are going to love it. Okay, so we're deploying the useless app we don't need. The deployment must be done 2 weeks from today. We're going to start work in a week, and we're going to test before that, and we're doing QA never. We're going to call the users to confirm that the app is working as intended, which is barely. The app must be deployed using Ansible according to ITIL best practices. Security should comply with the NIST 853. The dev team will start working on related microservice integrations in the week following the completion of QA. Brad will be fielding all questions related to the project. Thanks, Bard. Pizza will be provided for after-hour support staff on Friday, which is deployment day. Good luck, everybody, and never forget that we are a family. Slav says my eye is twitching. That is the correct answer. All right, so that was terrible. We've all been in a meeting like that at some point in the past. It's never fun. However, if you are the guy that takes that meeting, turns it into this shorthand, and then turns it into this follow up email, you'll be on the list for the next raise. I don't make the rules, it's just how it works. So, what we've gathered from the meeting is that deployment is going to be in 2 weeks. Just put date, D for date, deployment plus 2W, 2 weeks. Date, start plus 1 week. Date, testing now, because we have to test before we start deploying, and the only time to do that is this week. So they made the point that we're going to call the customers for QA. I need to research Ansible, ITIL, and NIST 800-53 because I don't know anything about those things. They made the point that the dev team will be working on integrations later, and they made the point that questions go to Brad. So leveraging what I remember from the meeting and what I have written in my notes, even if it's a few hours later, there's a pretty good chance that you remember 60% of the meeting and you have a good 80% of the things that you need in your shorthand. So between those two things, you can probably come up with a pretty good follow-up email to send out to your coworkers. So This is what I came up with. Starting testing this week. Need to make sure we're aware of any concerns related to NIST 853 and ITIL. Ansible will have to be configured to push the app when ready. It doesn't necessarily show that I understand these things, but it does show that I at least kind of Googled them very quickly, you know. And then coming up, the app will be rolled out next week. Cutover will be in 2 weeks. When the cutover happens, we'll follow up with the users via phone calls to see how the app is doing. Questions will go to Brad. The dev team will be working on integrations following a successful rollout. If you got that email, actually, chat, answer the question. If you got this follow up email after having to sit in that terrible meeting, is this more helpful than the meeting was? My Twitch is slightly yes. Yeah, that's I mean, yeah, you can't get rid of all the cringe. Seems that it's meeting that could have been an email, aren't they all? Like all the meeting notes, so see them before, during, and after. Yeah. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's not gonna be perfect, but the idea is to create something that is at least slightly helpful and is retained, right? Because the meeting is ephemeral; it is not going to exist once the meeting is over. The email will at least exist until the end of the retention policy, and longer if people are smart and archive it until the project is over. Uh, Next example of shorthand. This is not from a real pen test. However, I took a one that someone else had done and kind of adapted it um, to kind of fit the shorthand that I typically use. So from this, we can get enumeration started in map at 9:30 a.m. Exploitation SMB null session to DC1 at 9:45. Enumeration sysvol marketing past XLSX at 10 a.m. Access shared past MFA at 10 a.m. Enumeration Bloodhound 10:30. Enumeration crack map SMB shares 11:30, and then Privask ESC1 to DA at 12 p.m. If you're a pen tester and you're reading this, yes, I spent an hour looking at Bloodhound. That never actually happened. But using this shorthand, you can tell that like this is a few hours of testing, and there's not many words on the page, but that's a pretty good synopsis of what happened. And knowing that theoretically that I did the testing, I'm going to remember pretty well what happened, especially when I have this shorthand set of notes to back me up. When I write the report, it ends up looking like something on the right, where I'm telling the story without having to commit the time to initially writing that story while it's happening. Okay, yeah, I guess I can conclude. Keep your friends close and your notebook closer. Write something down every day. I don't care what it is, just write down something, even if it's just your name. Use shorthand and templates for speed. Rewrite your notes when you have spare time, and link your notes together to build a second brain, if you so choose. I'll go back to Q&A. Something. There you go. A question. Vouch for sync thing with just a bit of setup. Agree with config. Yep. Yeah, I mean it works. I've heard from several people that sync thing works relatively well, and they've got no issues with it. I just didn't feel like setting it up. It's just one more thing to look into, and I would rather give my money away. And if Corgi was correct, you guys should be able to unmute and yell at me if you so choose. We'll be moving over to chill chat shortly, I'm sure. And this was, I mean, this was kind of a light speed overview of everything I've learned about note taking in the past 5 years. I probably missed a bunch of stuff. There's probably a bunch of stuff out there that works better, or at least works better for you. Applications to check out. There's whatever. I would. How many knowledge management apps have you used in total? Best guess. Oh man. Um, I mean, does does every Markdown editor I could get my hands on count? Yeah, okay. I would say probably is somewhere in the neighborhood of 20. Over the past 5 years, probably 20. How do you handle screenshots in Obsidian? It's copy and paste. Uh, I don't know if there's like a core plugin that you have to put in, but the for the most part, just copy and paste works. You have to set up an attachment folder. Um, yeah, you have thousands in a single folder. You have to this go into a single one. So okay, so the attachment management plugin won't work retroactively for all of your attachments, but for future ones, the attachment management plugin is fantastic. It within your attachments folder will create subfolders for each note, and so you can pretty quickly filter down to exactly where you need to be, and just have the screenshots or attachments for that one specific note. Follow up, how do you handle potential client data contamination, different vaults? Yeah, if I'm putting sensitive stuff in a vault, I'm going to try to keep that separate, right? If I use Obsidian for work, I'm going to try to keep all of that somewhere where it's not going to interfere with my personal stuff. Or if I'm adding work notes or semi work related notes to my personal stuff, I'm going to try to keep it relatively vague so that it's, even if it gets into somebody's hands, they can't really do anything with it. In general, if you're taking notes, probably don't put API keys and things in there, just as a just as a general rule. Try handling as native as mentioned. Yeah. The only issue that I have with Obsidian at this point is that you can't have multiple accounts attached. So you can choose between your personal sync service or your work sync service, not both if you've got them on the same machine. But virtual machines are great. There's also a Docker container where you can do a web interface with Obsidian. So if you host your own servers or whatever, you can toss it up there in Docker container and access it in a web browser. Question: how do I deal with copying things I learn at work into my personal vault? Learn cool new pen testing technique. You just manually re-add the notes later. Um, it depends on what it is, right? Because a lot of times the knowledge that I'm gaining at work is not directly connected to the thing that I'm working on. At least not they're not so intertwined that I can't decouple them and take notes in two different places. So I think if I understand correctly, how I would handle that situation is that I would take notes at work as I'm working through things, and then on the personal side, I would just add a to do item to like research and write notes about whatever the tech is or whatever the technique is, uh, separately from all of that. Why should I do Zettelkasten if I'm not a masochist? Yeah, Zettelkasten is heavy. It's very heavy. Um, and there's a lot of resources out there that convolute it even worse than it needs to be. I took the I took a couple of hours researching the Zettelkasten methodology and boiled it down to uh, pretty simple components. Let me go back to the slide where I kind of covered it. Yeah, that's right here. So, like I said during the talk, I just keep all of my notes in my daily notes. I wanted the speed of only ever having one place to commit ideas to, and having the daily notes in Obsidian automatically generate, and now I have one central place that is going to be fresh every single day that I can commit notes to. Um, and then I start linking things outside of that, and it's a pretty. I just link the notes that I want to exist. If I want to write a note, I'll link it, as I mentioned that phrase or whatever else. That does mean that you probably have to have spaces in your file names. Um, I don't like it at all, but I mean, you got to do what you got to do. You got to make some concessions somewhere. Um, but yeah, no, I I keep all of my notes in a daily note, and then I'll pull those out to broader research notes when I feel like I'm ready, when I feel like I understand it well enough that it's not going to be super intense to go and write that full research document. Um, and then there's only so much folder management you can do, right? So if you just have a separate folder that has your map of content files and you're linking sets of notes and whatnot, organizing that way, I feel like that's a fairly simple approach, or it's a fairly simple approach to note taking, and it's also a fairly boiled down, uh, just the roots way to do Zettelkasten. And of course, if there's anything else that comes up over time that I feel like I need to add that is part of that framework, I'm already adhering to like 50-60% of it. So adding in the rest probably wouldn't be that difficult. It looks like permissions are still not. Well, we can we move everybody to chill chat? That would, or not chill chat, the lounge. I thought there was like a bulk way to do it. You just drag it, or not drag and drop. Just like send everybody all at once. Not bad.
Damn.